In November of 1934, on the sixth floor of the New York Supreme Court in Manhattan, an oak door closed on a judge, two lawyers, a stenographer, and a 10-year-old girl in a good coat. In the corridor outside, on a bench against the wall, the girl's mother sat down to wait. The door stayed shut for 2.5 hours. When it opened, the question of who the child belonged to had effectively been decided, and the woman in the corridor had not been in the room. I have gone back to that corridor more times than I can properly account for. It is a small scene in a very large case, and I have come to think it is the only part of the case that tells the truth about it. The girl was Gloria Laura Vanderbilt, 10 years old, heiress to a Vanderbilt trust. The woman on the bench was her mother, also named Gloria, a widow of 30. The woman who was suing for the child was her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, a sculptor who had opened a museum on West 8th Street 3 years earlier, and who was, by the standards of 1934, one of the wealthiest women alive. The trial had already been running for weeks. More than 100 reporters were downstairs. The mother's court-approved allowance was $4,000 a month, in a year when the average American family lived on about $1,745. The child's father had been a Vanderbilt who died owing money, with a personal estate of $423,761. The nurse who testified that the mother was unfit had been hired 2 weeks after the child was born and paid for 10 years out of the child's own trust. A French maid testified about what she said she had seen in a bedroom, and the judge cleared the room of the public and the press. And what was said on the worst days of that trial has been argued over ever since. The mother's own mother took the stand against her. In the same years she was paying for the case, the aunt was giving $160,000 a year to the museum that still carries her name. After the verdict, the mother lived on an allowance from her daughter of $21,000 a year, until 1946, when the daughter stopped it. 60 years later, the girl wrote that she had rehearsed what she said in that room with the lawyer for the other side. And the judge who took the child from her mother wrote, in the same decision, that the charge against the mother had not been proved. Every one of those things is in the record. Not one of them is the strangest part, and several of them are not the story anyone thinks they are. This is the story of a girl who was taken from her mother in a Manhattan courtroom in the autumn of 1934 and handed to an aunt who owned a museum. It is also the story of what a fortune can do to the truth when it is let into a courtroom ahead of the evidence, and of how the judge who took that child cleared her mother in writing of the one charge that had already destroyed her. I want to start in the corridor, with the woman on the bench, because everything that mattered in this case happened on one side or the other of a door she was not permitted to open. Before we go on, one quick thing. Subscribing helps build a community around stories like this. It rewards the work behind them. Chapter 1. The door on the 6th floor. The room was not a courtroom. It was the judge's chambers, and by the standards of the New York Supreme Court, it was a modest space, lined with books nobody in it was going to open that afternoon. Justice John Francis Carew presided. He was 61 years old, a former congressman who had served 8 terms as a Democrat out of New York before being put on the bench, and he had spent the better part of 2 months listening to servants describe the private life of a woman in her 20s. He had decided that the last testimony in the case would be given without an audience. The girl came in. She was 10. She had been living on her aunt's estate on Long Island for more than 2 years by then, ever since a tonsil operation and a convalescence that quietly became a residence. She had been examined by doctors who were paid by her aunt, watched by a nurse who was paid out of her own trust, and driven to the courthouse in a car that belonged to the richest woman in the room. The stenographers set up, The two lawyers took their seats. On one side was Nathan Birkin, who represented her mother, a man who had built a career representing Charlie Chaplin, and who had helped found the society that still collects royalties for American songwriters. On the other side was the Whitney side, and behind the Whitney side was a family lawyer named Frank Crocker, who had spent time with the girl before she walked in. Then the door closed. What was said in that room is known because a stenographer took it down. The judge asked the child how she would like living with her mother in the country. The child said no. She said never. She said she always wanted to live with her aunt. She was 10 years old, and she said it the way a child says a line she has already said before. And the judge, who had spent his life listening to people testify, appears to have believed her. 60 years later, in a memoir written when she was an old woman, she wrote that she had gone over what she was going to say again and again with the lawyer for the other side. I want to be careful here because this is the hinge of everything that follows, and it is easy to make it into something larger and uglier than the record will bear. A lawyer preparing a witness is not a crime. It is what lawyers do, and Nathan Birkin would have done the same if the child had been on his side of the case. But she was not on his side. She was the case. And the single most consequential piece of evidence in the most publicized custody trial in American history was produced in a closed room by a 10-year-old after coaching, with her mother sitting on a bench in the corridor outside. The proceeding that put her there had a name that sounds, in this context, almost absurd. It was a writ of habeas corpus. It is the oldest liberty instrument in the English-speaking world. The demand that a person being held be produced in open court. And it had been served on Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney in September, commanding her to produce the body of Gloria Laura Morgan Vanderbilt. The great writ against unlawful imprisonment, deployed to settle where a little girl would spend her weekends. 2.5 hours later, the door opened. The mother stood up. Her daughter came out. Whatever was said between them in that corridor is not recorded, and I have not been able to find any account of it that I trust. The reporters were downstairs. The stenographer's book was closed. The thing to understand about that afternoon is that neither woman fighting over the child was poor, and only one of them had money. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt lived on an allowance that a court had approved, and a court could reduce, drawn from a trust that belonged to her daughter. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney lived on a fortune that had been assembled over 3 generations out of streetcar franchises, refinery dividends, and a marriage. The difference between those two positions is the difference between having an income and having a fortune, and it is the whole story of what happened on that floor. To understand how one woman came to be sitting on the bench and the other came to be sitting in the room, you have to go back 60 years, to a young lawyer in Massachusetts who understood, before almost anyone else in America, what a city was going to be worth. Chapter 2. Streetcars and Standard Oil. William Collins Whitney was born on the 5th of July, 1841, in Conway, Massachusetts, a lawyer's son who went to Yale and came out of it with a taste for politics and a very clear eye for the machinery underneath it. He married Flora Payne in 1869. This was the decisive act of his life, and it had almost nothing to do with love, though by most accounts there was that too. Flora Payne was the daughter of an Ohio senator, and, more to the point, she was the sister of Oliver Hazard Payne, who was the treasurer of the Standard Oil Company. In the language of the period, Whitney had married well. What he had actually done was to marry a dividend. He rose fast. He was corporation counsel for New York City. He was Secretary of the Navy under Grover Cleveland from 1885 to 1889, and he is genuinely credited with beginning the modernization of the American fleet. And when he came back to New York, he did the thing that made the family fortune, which was to consolidate the city's street railway franchises into a single system. It is worth pausing on what that meant. Every horsecar line, every cable line, every eventual electric trolley in a city that was becoming the largest in the Western world had to run over a franchise granted by the municipality. Whitney and his partners acquired those franchises, combined them, capitalized the combination, and sold the paper. Reformers of the period used harder words for the process. The courts of the period mostly did not. By 1900, his fortune was estimated to exceed $40 million, and it had been made out of the right to move people across streets that belonged to everyone. He died on the 2nd of February, 1904. His eldest son, Harry Payne Whitney, inherited roughly $24 million. When Oliver Hazard Payne died, the Standard Oil side of the family added about $12 million more. Harry Payne Whitney was born on the 29th of April, 1872. He bred racehorses, sat on boards, and managed a fortune he had not made. On the 25th of August, 1896, in Newport, Rhode Island, he married Gertrude Vanderbilt. She was 21. She had been born on the 9th of January, 1875, the second daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, which is to say, she was a great-granddaughter of the Commodore. She brought a quarter interest in a $20 million Vanderbilt trust and $1,125,000 outright from her grandfather's estate. So the wedding at Newport joined a street railway fortune, a Standard Oil dividend, and a railroad inheritance in one household, and produced a woman who would spend the next 40 years being described in the newspapers as the richest woman in America. That description was never a precise ranking. It was a way of saying that the ordinary limits did not apply to her. What is easy to miss from this distance is how little any of that had to do with what she actually wanted. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney wanted to be a sculptor. She was a serious one. She kept a studio in Greenwich Village and she worked in it, and she spent decades and an enormous amount of money buying the work of living American artists at a time when the American museums would not have them. She bought a hayloft at 19 McDougal Alley in Greenwich Village in 1907 and turned it into a studio. She built another at Old Westbury in 1912. She showed young Americans nobody else would hang, and in 1929 she offered her collection, variously counted at 500 and at nearly 700 works, to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, along with the money to build a wing to hold it. The Metropolitan declined. It did not collect American art. So in November of 1931, she opened her own museum in 3 converted row houses on West 8th Street, a few doors from the studio, and called it the Whitney Museum of American Art. She was giving it $160,000 a year. None of that would matter here except for one thing. A woman with that much money, who had spent her life being told that her seriousness was a hobby, was not a woman who could be told what she could and could not do about a child. Her husband died on the 26th of October, 1930. He left an estate reported at about $72 million, and something closer to $63 million after the state was finished with it. The bulk of it went into trust for their 3 children. What Gertrude took was a life interest, broad discretionary powers over the remainder, and a fortune of her own that had never depended on his. She was 55 years old, and she was, in the second year of the Great Depression, answerable to nobody. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. Chapter 3. Sandy Point. Sandy Point Farm sat outside Portsmouth, Rhode Island, and it was where the horses were, and it was where Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt died on the 4th of September, 1925, of a hemorrhage brought on by cirrhosis of the liver. He was 45. He was Gertrude's younger brother, the youngest son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, and he had been given a fortune and a coaching whip and very little else. He went to Yale. He did not finish. He drove four-in-hand carriages beautifully, he gambled, and he drank in a way that the family and the newspapers of the period both agreed to describe as a fondness for society. Here it is worth saying plainly what the title above will never say, because the number in it was invented for a thumbnail. There was no $100 million trial. The $100 million belonged to the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who died in 1877, leaving roughly that much, the largest fortune in America at the time. By the time it reached his great-grandson Reginald, 4 generations of division and expenditure had done their work. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in 1899, Reginald came into something on the order of $7.5 million in cash and securities. That was a great deal of money. In 26 years, he went through nearly all of it. The money went the way that kind of money goes. It went on horses, and on the keeping of horses, on a farm in Rhode Island, and a townhouse at 12 East 77th Street, on cards, and on the settling of card debts, and on the long, expensive business of being a Vanderbilt in public. He borrowed against what he could not sell. By the end, there were creditors. He married twice. His first wife, Kathleen Nielsen, gave him a daughter, also called Kathleen, born in 1904. That marriage ended, and on the 6th of March 1923, at the age of 43, he married Gloria Morgan, who was 17 or 18, depending on which of her mother's accounts of her birth you accept. Their daughter was born on the 20th of February 1924 in Manhattan and named Gloria Laura Vanderbilt. The child was 19 months old when her father died. What he left is the fact on which everything afterward turns, and it deserves to be said slowly. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt of the Vanderbilts died with a personal estate later reported at $423,761, and it was not enough to cover what he owed, what he could not spend, because it had been placed beyond his reach by his father's estate, was a $5 million trust, and that trust now belonged, in 2 halves, to his 2 daughters. Little Gloria's share is variously reported at $2.5 million and at something closer to 5, and the discrepancy has never been fully resolved in the public accounts. What is certain is that a 21-year-old widow with roughly $130,000 to her name was now the mother of one of the richest children in America. And so, the Surrogates Court of New York County, in the person of surrogate James Aloysius Foley, granted the mother an allowance out of the daughter's trust for the daughter's maintenance. $4,000 a month, $48,000 a year. I have turned that arrangement over a great many times, and I do not think its strangeness has ever been properly stated. The mother had no money. The child had a fortune. So the child's fortune paid for the mother's household, the mother's servants, the mother's travel, and the mother's clothes, on the theory that a child of that class must be raised in a manner appropriate to it. Every dress Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt bought was, in a technical and eventually a legal sense, bought with her daughter's money. An arrangement like that has a hook in it. It makes the mother dependent, and it makes her auditable. Every dollar she spends can be produced later, in a courtroom, by people who can afford accountants, and set against a photograph of her at a party in Cannes. She was 21 years old. Nobody explained the hook to her. She took the money, and she went to Europe. Chapter 4. The Tender Years. By the 1920s, Every state in the Union had settled on the same rule for the custody of small children, and it favored mothers. It was called the tender years doctrine, and it held that a child of tender age belonged with its mother unless something was seriously wrong with her. It had displaced an older common law rule under which children were essentially the property of their fathers. It was reinforced in the 1930s by a new psychological vocabulary that treated the bond between a mother and a young child as the foundation of everything that came after. The doctrine was a presumption, not a guarantee. It could be rebutted. And there was exactly one way to rebut it, which was to prove that the mother was unfit. This is the fact that organizes the entire Vanderbilt case, and it is almost never stated in the popular accounts of it. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney could not win by arguing that her niece would be better off in a house with a sergeant on the wall. No American court in 1934 would have taken a child from a competent mother on the grounds that the aunt was richer. The law did not permit that argument, and Whitney's lawyers never made it. What the law permitted was a very different argument, and it required a very different kind of evidence. It required testimony about what a woman did at night, and with whom, and how often she was not in the house where her daughter slept. It required doctors and servants, and, if they could be had, detectives. It required somebody to be watching a young widow in Paris and writing down what they saw. That kind of evidence is not free. It has to be gathered over years by people who are paid to gather it, and then it has to be presented by lawyers who know how to make it land. The tender years doctrine, written to protect mothers, could in practice only be overcome by someone with the resources to take a mother's private life apart in public. The doctrine did not fail Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt because it was weak. It failed her because it was expensive to defeat, and the woman on the other side could afford it. Set the two positions side by side, and the shape of the thing appears. To defend herself, a mother needed counsel who could cross-examine servants, investigators who could establish where she had actually been on given nights, physicians willing to testify about a child's health, and the means to carry an adverse ruling up through the appellate courts, and, if necessary, to Washington. In 1934, there was no organized system in New York for providing any of that to a woman who could not pay for it. Custody, for the poor, was decided by whoever had the child and whoever was willing to swear about it. There was one further vulnerability, and it was procedural, and it came out of a lie her own mother had told for years about her age. Laura Kilpatrick Morgan had long insisted that her twin daughters were born in 1905 rather than 1904. If that was true, then Gloria Morgan had still been a legal infant when her husband died and could not have been appointed guardian of her own daughter's person. She had never been formally appointed. For 9 years, nobody had needed to notice. When Nathan Birkin finally went to Surrogate Foley to have her named guardian, the petition was challenged, and the challenge became the war. It is worth remembering what was happening outside the courthouse while all of this was argued. In 1934, unemployment in the United States stood near 21%, and the average American family lived on about $1,745 a year. 2 years earlier, some 20,000 children had been given up to New York institutions by parents who could no longer feed them. A mother in Queens who lost her children to the city in 1932 had no counsel, no detectives, no appeal, and no reporters. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt drew $4,000 a month. She was, by any measure available to the people reading about her, an extraordinarily fortunate woman. And within the world she actually lived in, she was the poorest person in the case. Hit subscribe if you want the next story. It costs nothing and takes a second. Chapter 5. Cafe Society. Gloria Morgan and Thelma Morgan were identical twins, born on the 23rd of August, 1904, in Lucerne, Switzerland, the daughters of an American diplomat named Harry Hayes Morgan and a woman named Laura Kilpatrick Morgan, who would prove to be the most dangerous person in either of their lives. They were raised in consulates and hotels. They were beautiful in a way that the photographers of the period found extremely convenient, and they moved, from their late teens onward, through a world that had not existed a generation earlier and would not survive the war that was coming. Paris, Biarritz, Cannes, Monte Carlo, a world of transatlantic liners and rented villas and men with titles, in which an American girl with a good face could marry into anything. Thelma married a British shipping viscount and became Lady Furness. From about 1929, she was the mistress of Edward, Prince of Wales, the heir to the British throne. On the 10th of January 1931, at a house party at Borough Court, she introduced him to an American woman named Wallis Simpson. She was doing a friend a kindness. 5 years later, the prince gave up the throne of England for the woman Thelma had introduced him to. That is the world Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was widowed into at 21, with a 19-month-old daughter and $48,000 a year. She was, for a period after Reginald's death, engaged to Prince Gottfried zu Hohenlohe-Langenburg, a great-grandson of Queen Victoria. There were other men. There was a great deal of travel, and the daughter, in all of it, was largely somewhere else. The nurse had been hired 2 weeks after the child was born. Her name was Emma Sullivan Kieslich, and the little girl called her Dodo, and for the first decade of her life, this woman was the constant adult presence in it. The grandmother, Laura Morgan, was the other. Between them, a nurse on a salary and a grandmother with a grievance raised a child who saw her mother in the way children of that class often saw their mothers, which is to say, at intervals, beautifully dressed, on the way out. The child wrote postcards. One of them, written from yet another temporary address, says that they were moving again and asks what kind of life this is. She was 8 years old. I have to be honest here because the temptation with a woman like this is to make her into a martyr, and she was not one. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was an absent mother. Her own grandson, the journalist Anderson Cooper, said as much decades later, plainly and without much charity, when he observed that his grandmother's maintenance money had gone into her own care and feeding and her own social life. The evidence for the neglect is not a Whitney invention. It is in the child's own recollections, in the postcards, in the calendar of a woman who spent long stretches on the other side of an ocean from a daughter who was ill. Hold both of those things at once, because nothing that follows makes sense unless you can. A woman can be a poor mother and still be the victim of what was done to her. Neglect is a matter of degree, and the law of 1934 had a word for the point at which it stopped being a private failing and became a legal disqualification, and the word was unfitness, and that word had to be proved. There was also a friendship that would be turned into a weapon. Among the women in Gloria Morgan's circle in London was Nada, Marchioness of Milford Haven, a granddaughter of a Russian Grand Duke and the wife of a Mountbatten. What passed between them was denied on oath in 1934 and was acknowledged, long afterward, by members of both families. At the time, it was simply a friendship between two women in a set where nobody asked. It would be produced a decade later by a French maid on a witness stand. And when the case came, Thelma came with it. She crossed the Atlantic in the winter of 1934 to stand beside her sister, and while she sat in a New York courtroom, the Prince of Wales, 3,000 miles away, was falling in love with the woman she had introduced him to. She lost him that winter. Her sister lost rather more. In the summer of 1932, the child's tonsils were removed in New York. She was sent out to Long Island to recover. to her aunt's estate at Old Westbury, a place of 1,000 acres and horses and quiet. A doctor connected to the Whitney household advised that she should stay a while longer. By the autumn, Surrogate Foley had cut the mother's allowance from $48,000 a year to $9,000, on the sensible ground that the child was no longer living with her. The mother had lost in a single stroke 4/5 of her income, and the only argument she had for needing it. The child stayed at Old Westbury for 2 years. And on Long Island, in a house on 1,000 acres, a 57-year-old sculptor who had buried her husband and who had recently opened a museum was watching a little girl play in a garden and coming to a conclusion about where that girl belonged. Chapter 6. The Woman in the Studio. There is a photograph of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney standing in her studio at Old Westbury in a smock among plaster, and she is not smiling. And she looks like a woman at work. She had built that studio in 1912, on the estate, at a distance from the house. Delano and Aldrich designed it. Robert Winthrop Chandler decorated it. She went there in the mornings and stayed. By the standards of the women of her class and generation, this was an eccentricity that had to be forgiven rather than an occupation that could be respected. And she spent her life on the wrong side of that distinction. She was a Vanderbilt who made things with her hands. Her marriage to Harry Payne Whitney had been unfaithful on both sides for many years, by every account that survives. She had lovers. He had lovers. Their arrangement was the arrangement of their class, which was that nobody said anything and nobody wrote anything down, and the money made the silence hold. 2 women stood on either side of that case. Both had marriages that had failed privately while succeeding publicly. Both had taken lovers. Only one of them had a French maid put on a witness stand to describe her bedroom. The mother's lawyers did try. They raised the matter of the aunt's art, the nudes, the unconventional company of Greenwich Village, the idea that a woman who sculpted naked bodies might not be the appropriate guardian of a young girl. It went nowhere, and it was always going to go nowhere. There were no detectives following Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney across Europe, writing down which bedroom she came out of in the morning. There was nobody on her payroll who could be induced to testify about her. She had never in her life had to explain herself to anyone who could compel an answer. That is a remark about her position rather than her character, and the two are easy to confuse, and this case has been confusing them for 90 years. In June of 1932, her niece had her tonsils out and was sent to Old Westbury to recover. A physician connected to the household advised that the child stay on. She stayed on that summer, and through the autumn, and through the winter, and the following year, and the year after that. There is an account of the moment Gertrude Whitney decided to keep her, and it comes from the child herself, told years later to her son. The nurse took the girl out of her mother's house, saying they were going to feed the pigeons in Central Park, and took her instead downtown to the Greenwich Village studio. There, in front of her aunt, the child broke down and said that her mother wanted to kill her and that she wanted to die. A doctor was called. To Gertrude Whitney, looking at a terrified 9-year-old in her studio, taking her in would have seemed like the only decent thing a person could do. That scene is the most sympathetic thing in the case, and also the most damning. A child does not arrive at that sentence on her own. The nurse who brought her there had lived in the mother's house for 9 years on the trust's money, and the judge would eventually find that this same nurse had spent years turning the girl against her mother. The moment that justified the custody suit may itself have been manufactured by the household that stood to gain from it. Both readings fit the facts. I cannot separate them, and there is little sign that Gertrude Whitney could either. The child stayed. She had a room. She had the nurse she had known since she was 2 weeks old. She had a pony and a garden, and guards posted through the house, and no mother in the building. The mother, meanwhile, had lost 4/5 of her income and was living in Europe on the remainder. Set the two households beside each other in those years, and the case is already over. On one side, 1,000 acres, a staff, a stable, a physician who came when called, and a woman of 57 who was at that moment giving $160,000 a year to a museum she had founded. On the other, a woman of 28 in rented rooms, whose income was $9,000 a year, and who had to ask a surrogate's court for permission to spend her own daughter's money on her own daughter. Whichever way a court eventually ruled, only one of those two women was going to be able to afford to find out. Before any of it reached a courtroom, Gertrude Whitney tried to buy the outcome outright. She offered the mother $50,000 a year for life to give up the child. A judge, by one account, urged the mother not to put her daughter through a public trial at all. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt refused the money. Her daughter later wrote that she refused it because taking it would have cost her the only thing she had, which was her standing as Mrs. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, and a woman who sold her child would have been finished in the only society she knew. That is not a flattering explanation, and it came from the daughter, and it may well be true. So when she finally moved to formalize her position as her daughter's legal guardian, which she had somehow never been, the Whitney side did not negotiate. In late September of 1934, asked to send the girl back, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney simply declined. There is a particular kind of power in that. Not the power to win an argument, but the power to decline to have one. A woman with 1,000 acres and a legal department can keep a child in a house and let the other party go to law about it. And she can afford to lose in the first instance, and in the second, and to appeal. The mother could afford none of that, which is why, on the last day of that month, a process server went out to Long Island with a piece of paper that had been used for 300 years against kings. Subscribing is how stories like this keep showing up in your feed. It is free. Chapter 7. The Writ. The writ of habeas corpus is the oldest instrument of liberty in the English-speaking world. It is a command, addressed to whoever is holding a person, to produce that person before a court and justify the holding. It was written for prisoners. The writ served on Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney in September of 1934 commanded her to produce the body of Gloria Laura Morgan Vanderbilt, aged 10. The trial opened on the 1st of October before Justice John Francis Carew in the New York Supreme Court. More than 100 reporters came. The Daily News and the Daily Mirror and the Hearst papers had been living on this kind of story for a decade, and they had never had one like this, because this one had everything. It had a dead Vanderbilt. It had a young widow with a title-hunting past. It had a museum and 1,000 acres and a nurse and a fortune and a little girl. The country outside was in its 5th year of the Depression. Unemployment stood near 21%. The average American family lived on about $1,745 a year, which was rather less than Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt had been drawing every fortnight before the surrogate cut her off. 2 years earlier, some 20,000 children had been surrendered to New York City institutions by parents who could no longer feed them. The newspapers that carried the trial were sold to men who did not have work, and the trial was about which of two wealthy women should be permitted to raise a girl who would never want for anything either way. That was the appetite the tabloids were feeding. It is worth remembering, when the testimony gets ugly, that a great many of the people reading it had lost children to the city for no better reason than poverty and had been given no trial at all. Consider the two sides. For the mother stood Nathan Birkin. He was one of the finest lawyers in New York, a man who had made his name in the new law of copyright and entertainment, who had helped found the society that collects royalties for American songwriters, who had represented Charlie Chaplin and Mae West and Florence Ziegfeld, who was a power in Tammany Hall, and whose obituary would describe him as an expert cross-examiner. He came to the case through a theater magnate who was one of the mother's lovers, which tells you something about the world she moved in and something about how she found her defense. This is important, and it is the thing the popular retellings always get wrong. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was not out-lawyered. She had one of the best trial advocates in the city, and he fought the case as well as it could have been fought. For the aunt stood Herbert Smith, who conducted the trial, and behind him, Frank Crocker, the family lawyer who was also an executor of Harry Payne Whitney's estate. And behind both of them stood something Birkin did not have, and could not buy, and had no answer to. It was not a better lawyer, it was an apparatus. By the accounts that have come down to us, most of them tracing back to a single biographer working in the 1970s, private detectives had been engaged. Their reports are not in the public record and cannot now be examined. What is in the public record is who testified, and it is worth naming them slowly. Emma Sullivan Kieslick, the nurse, who had been hired 2 weeks after the child was born and who had lived in the mother's household for 10 years and whose salary had come out of the child's trust. Maria Caillot, a French maid, who had been in the mother's employ in Paris. Laura Kilpatrick Morgan, the child's grandmother, the mother's own mother. And various physicians who had examined the child at Old Westbury. Every one of those people had been at some point inside Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's household. Several of them had been paid, directly or indirectly, out of the trust that existed for her daughter's benefit. And every one of them was now on the other side. That is what money bought in this case. Not a verdict and not a lie. It bought access to the interior of a woman's life. It bought the people who had watched her dress, who knew who came to dinner, who knew what time she came home, and whether the child was awake when she did. Wealth did not have to invent anything. It only had to gather what was already there and organize it, and pay for a lawyer who knew the order to put it in. And there is one more turn of the screw in it, which took me a while to see. The trust existed for the child's benefit. The nurse's wages came out of the trust. The household in which the maid served was maintained out of the trust. The physicians who examined the girl were paid by the aunt, and the trust would eventually pay the fees of the lawyers on both sides of the case. The mother was not merely being tried. She was being tried with her daughter's money, by witnesses her daughter's money had employed, over the question of whether she could be trusted with her daughter's money. And then they called the maid. Chapter 8. Closed to the public. Maria Caillot testified that she had entered a bedroom in Paris and seen her employer in bed with another woman, and that the two of them were kissing in a manner she described as the manner of lovers. The other woman was named. She was Nada, Marchioness of Milford Haven, a granddaughter of a Russian Grand Duke, married into the Mountbatten family. It took 4 days for that testimony to travel around the world. Justice Carew cleared the court. The reporters went out. The public went out. The doors were shut, and the remainder of the most famous custody trial in American history was conducted in a room the public could not enter. What was said in the closed sessions has been argued over ever since, because the record of it has never been fully and reliably available, and much of what people now believe they know about those days descends from a book published in 1980 and a television film made 2 years after that. Precision matters here more than anywhere else in the account. Nada denied it and called the allegation a malicious and terrible lie. She was a granddaughter of a Russian Grand Duke, married into a family that stood beside the British throne, and she was in a position to say that and be believed. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt denied it too, and was not. Many years later, in her own writing, and later still through a member of the Mountbatten family, the relationship between the two women was acknowledged. So the maid was probably, in the ordinary sense, telling the truth about what she saw. And it did not matter. Not legally. Not in the way everyone in that courtroom assumed it did. Hold that fact for 2 chapters because it is the whole argument. And it is coming. What the closed courtroom accomplished was something else entirely. A closed courtroom protects a child. And Carew almost certainly closed it for that reason. And a man of his generation would have thought he was being humane. But a closed courtroom also removes the only mechanism by which anyone outside the room could check what was done inside it. The press could not report the testimony. The public could not weigh it. The mother's reputation had already been destroyed in the 4 days before the doors shut, by the coverage of a maid describing a bedroom, and now there would be no coverage of anything that came afterward, including whatever answer she gave. Something else should be said about the sources. The version of these weeks that has passed into general circulation comes from a book published in 1980 and a television film made 2 years later. Both of them works of interpretation, both of them dramatized in places, and both of them written long after every principal but one was dead. Where the account here rests on that material rather than on the trial record, it says so. A great deal of what is confidently repeated about the closed sessions rests on very little. Then the nurse testified. Emma Keislich told the court about the mother's absences, about the drinking, about the men, about a child who did not know where her mother was. She had raised that girl. The girl called her Dodo. She sat in the witness box and she told a courtroom that the woman who employed her was not fit to keep her own daughter. And by the end of the case, Justice Carew had concluded that Keislich had spent years turning the child against her mother and ordered her dismissed. Both of those things are true. The nurse was believed, and the nurse was removed for what her believability had been built out of. And then Laura Kilpatrick Morgan took the stand against her own daughter. She had lied about her daughter's ages for years, a lie which had incidentally left her daughter unable to claim she had been of full age at her husband's death. She had been the child's other constant. She sided with the Whitneys. I have read a good deal about this woman and do not understand her, and will not pretend otherwise. Between the maid, the nurse, and the grandmother, the pattern of the Whitney case is complete. Not one of those 3 witnesses was a stranger. Every one of them had stood inside the mother's rooms, drawn wages from her household, or held her child. The most private life in America was opened up and read out by the people who had lived in it, and every one of them had at some point been paid out of the same trust. The last testimony came in chambers, on the 6th floor, behind an oak door, in a room the mother could not enter. If you are still watching, you are who I make these for. Subscribe, and I will keep making them. Chapter 9. $9,000. On the 21st of November, 1934, Justice Carew handed down his decision. Custody of Gloria Laura Vanderbilt went to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. The mother was granted her daughter on weekends, from Saturday morning until Sunday evening. She was granted the month of July. She was granted 8 hours on Christmas Day. The nurse, Emma Keislich, was ordered dismissed from the child's life for having poisoned her against her mother. The mother was removed as administrator of her daughter's trust. Surrogate Foley had already, 2 years earlier, cut her allowance from $48,000 a year to $9,000. Consider what the mother was actually granted. 2 days in 7, 1 month in 12, and, on the 25th of December, from the middle of the morning to the middle of the evening, 8 hours. A court had sat down and calculated, in hours, how much of a mother a woman would be permitted to remain. The weekends, when they came, were supervised. The girl was brought into Manhattan under guard to her mother's hotel suite, where a detective and a nurse were generally present, and where reporters waited on the pavement to shout at a child. Nathan Burkhan appealed. The appellate division affirmed. The Court of Appeals of New York would not take it. The Supreme Court of the United States declined to hear it. In 1936, the matter was reopened, went up again, was declined again in Washington, and came back to the New York Supreme Court, which gave the mother a little more time with her daughter and nothing else. Burkhan was dead within months of that. He was 56. Now hold everything still, because here is the sentence this whole account has been walking toward. In the same decision in which he took her child away from her, Justice John Francis Carew found that the charge of a lesbian affair had not been proved. He wrote that the accusation had been so detrimental and the evidence offered for it so unsubstantial that she was entitled to unqualified and complete exoneration. Those were close to his own words. He cleared her. Read that again slowly. The testimony that emptied the courtroom, that put her name in every tabloid in America, that made her a byword for a certain kind of ruined woman for 30 years, that her own family and her own servants had built against her, was rejected by the judge as insufficient. And the same judge, in the same document, took her daughter. It is worth sitting with the mechanics of that for a moment, because they are stranger than the scandal. The allegation that ruined her was rejected. The reputation it destroyed was never restored, because a judge's finding of insufficiency runs to about one paragraph, and a tabloid headline runs for years. She was acquitted in the only forum that could convict her, and convicted in the only forum that mattered. So what did he take her for? He took her for the rest of it, for the absences, for the travel, for a child raised by a nurse, for a mother who was, in the language of the period, not devoted. He took her for maternal neglect, which was real, and which the record supports, and which a great many mothers of that class committed every year of the 1930s without ever losing a child, because nobody was paying detectives to write it down. Neglect is a matter of degree. In 1934, it became a legal disqualification at the precise point where somebody with money decided to prove it, in a courtroom, over 7 weeks, with servants. Consider what that took. It took a trial advocate and a family lawyer and their firms. It took investigators willing to follow a woman across a continent. It took physicians of standing. It took the ability to lose in the trial court and go to the appellate division, and to lose there and go to Albany, and to lose there and go to Washington. Twice. A woman in Queens who lost her children to the city that same winter had none of those things and no prospect of any of them. She had no counsel, because in 1934 New York had no organized system for giving her one, and no appeal, because appeals cost money, and no reporters, because nobody wanted to read about her. The tender years doctrine was supposed to protect both of those women equally. It protected neither. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt lost her daughter, and she lost the trust income, and she was left with a reputation that a judge had cleared her of, and the newspapers never would. She was 30 years old. She never remarried, she never regained custody, she never worked, and for the next 12 years she lived on $21,000 a year, paid to her by her own child. 2 days a week, 1 month a year, 8 hours at Christmas. There is a receipt buried in that arrangement, and it is worth reading. The court had removed the mother from the trust on the ground that she had lived on her daughter's money. It then left her with no way to live except on her daughter's money. The disqualification and the dependency were the same fact entered twice. In 1946, the child stopped paying it. Chapter 10. What the record does not say. Old Westbury is gone now, most of it. The estate was broken up. The studio where Gertrude Whitney worked survives on a parcel of 6.5 acres, and some years ago, it was listed for sale at a price that would have bought the whole of Reginald Vanderbilt's estate twice over. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney died on the 18th of April, 1942, of a heart condition, and she is buried at Woodlawn. The newspapers guessed her fortune at $25 or $50 million. When her estate was actually accounted, the figure was $10,590,492. She had given most of the rest away, much of it to the museum, which she endowed at her death with $2.5 million more, and which is now the permanent home of American art in the city where she was born. It is the thing that outlived everybody in this account. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt died of cancer on the 13th of February, 1965, at 60. She had by then been for 30 years the woman from the trial and nothing else. Kathleen, the half-sister, the other beneficiary of the $5 million trust, died in Havana in 1944. She was 40. Emma Kieslich, the nurse, was put out of the child's life by court order and, according to what Gloria Vanderbilt wrote long afterward, was never entirely out of her thoughts. The girl came into her trust at 21 in 1945. It had grown by then to something near $4,700,000. She married 4 times. She painted, she acted. In 1979, she put her name on the back pocket of a pair of jeans and took a royalty of 3.5% on $125 million of sales in that single year, which meant that of everyone in this account, the person who made the most money out of the Vanderbilt name was the 10-year-old in the corridor. She buried a son. She raised another one who reads the news. She died on the 17th of June, 2019, of stomach cancer at 95. And late in her life, in a memoir, she wrote that before she went into the judge's chambers, she had rehearsed what she would say, again and again, with Frank Crocker. Let me stop the clock there because the chronology has run out, and the chronology was never the argument. It would be easy to finish this by saying that a rich woman bought a child in a New York courtroom. That is not what the record shows, and it is not what happened. Gertrude Whitney appears to have loved that girl. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was genuinely, culpably, absent from her daughter's childhood. There is no innocent party here, and anyone who tells you there is has not read the testimony. I have spent longer with this case than it deserves, and what strikes me is something narrower and worse than the version everybody knows. Not that the mother was framed, because she was not. It is that the same instrument was never once turned around. Nobody followed Gertrude Whitney to Paris. Nobody deposed her lovers. Nobody put her household staff in a witness box and asked them what time she came home, and whether the children were awake, and who was in the bedroom. The instrument that took a daughter from her mother existed. It worked. It simply cost more than one of the 2 women in that courtroom had, and it was pointed, for 7 weeks, in one direction only. What survived is easy to list. The museum on 8th Street survived and moved downtown and is still there. The trust survived and grew and made a designer out of a frightened child. The name survived, on a pair of jeans, on a building, on a wing. The Whitney fortune survived so completely that a person can walk past its monuments all week without once hearing the word Vanderbilt spoken in the same breath. What did not survive was one woman standing as her daughter's mother, revoked in a courtroom on a charge that the judge himself threw out and never given back. And so come back one last time to the 6th floor of the New York Supreme Court in November of 1934. The oak door, the judge, the 2 lawyers, the stenographer, the 10-year-old girl in the good coat, saying her lines. The corridor outside. The bench against the wall. The mother sitting on it with her hands in her lap, 30 years old, waiting for 2.5 hours to find out whether she was still a mother. While on the other side of a door she was not permitted to open, her daughter answered questions that had been rehearsed with the other side's lawyer. Every hour of those 7 weeks, every servant, every detective, every appeal to Washington, every dollar of the $423,761 her husband died owing, and every dollar of the $72 million her sister-in-law inherited, comes to rest on that bench, in that corridor, with that woman, on the wrong side of that door. The door on the 6th floor took a moment to close, and the woman in the corridor was still sitting there when it opened. This is the kind of story this channel exists for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.